If you are a fish in Australia, you might be aware that there's a certain disease going around right now. This is no COVID-19, nor just a common cold. It is literal fish herpes. And for the first time in recorded history, it's entirely engineered by the Australian government. If you know anything about fish, fishing, or even just nature in general, you've probably heard of carp. They're fairly large fish who will eat absolutely anything and everything. They outcompete other predators and eat other prey. Needless to say, they become very invasive everywhere that they end up. And recently, I made an entire video about how the United States Army is literally at war with carp right now and spending billions of dollars to fight them and build electrical barriers to prevent them from getting into the Great Lakes, and despite all of that money and effort, the Army is still losing. See, this isn't your typical case of an invasive species coming in, the government pretends to care and throws some money at it, the problem never gets fixed, and the consequences play out as they always would had no one ever gotten involved in the first place. When it comes to conservation, it's typically the efforts of a few dedicated people who are underpaid and underfunded and are trying to protect animals because they think larger than just themselves. Governments provide them minimal funding so that they can act like they care about the environment, which they don't, and that's about the extent of it. But carp are different. Governments do care, and they care big time, because these aren't just threatening little native species that the government is pretending to care about, they are threatening billion-dollar industries. Carp aren't the kind of invasive species that just threatens a native little animal that people don't notice when it disappears. They're an entirely different kind of invasive species, one which we have not experienced in the animal kingdom before. They eat everything in sight, decimating the food chain above them and below them. They can live in almost any water body, dirty or clean, still or flowing, at any temperature, in any conditions. So when they show up, they're not just threatening native species, they're threatening billion-dollar fishing industries, billion-dollar recreational industries, and the health of basically every aquatic organism in the area. Funnily enough though, and this may not surprise you, when carp showed up in Australia for the first time over 100 years ago, it was entirely on purpose. This seems to happen often. We think we can use nature to solve our problems, and instead nature ends up using us. The reasoning that they did this isn't exactly clear, but the leading theory seems to be that they wanted to imitate the ecosystems back in Europe, where most of the people in Australia had come from, and where the European carp, our culprit in this case, is native to. Which, may I say, is incredibly stupid. Even for someone in the 1800s, and that's a pretty low bar. At least Americans brought carp into the country to try and solve a problem. There was too much vegetation in these ponds, they were trying to get rid of harmful algae and bacteria. Listen, the problem was stupid, and the carp were a terrible solution that didn't work, so I can't really take moral high ground here. Okay, let's just all agree that humans had a really uninformed relationship with carp. Now, in the modern day, carp are everywhere in Australia. In some rivers, they make up 90% of the biomass. That means that if you laid out every living thing in the river, if you dredged a net through the entire river, pulled out everything that was alive in there, and then weighed them all, 90% of that weight would just be common carp. That's ridiculous. Think about how many common carp that is. And yet, they provide nothing to these ecosystems that they're in. And because Australia has already been struggling with a polluted river problem, they dominate every water body they get into where native species are already struggling. As pollution rises, fish that aren't used to that pollution get pushed out and struggle to survive, and invasive species like carp have an even more successful time. So, the Australian government decided that they needed to act, and they acted with wonderful news headlines such as, Australian government plans to capitalize on carp orgies. Yeah, they announced a new plan to deal with these invading fish in a way that has not really been seen before. To be clear, they did not create this disease from scratch. Carp pox and other carp-specific diseases have existed in nature long before humans. But the researchers in Australia specifically weaponized and artificially selected strains of this carp herpes to make it more deadly and to spread faster. Their plan is to release it in areas with a ton of carp, and hopes that it wipes them all out during close contact, such as when they're all trying to reproduce, as the headline said, in carp orgies. Now, this solution is obviously not going to kill all of the carp. They're way too good at surviving, and in way too many places for that to be possible. But lowering the amount of them in the water can provide a massive benefit to the ecosystem. And it can also allow things to take up some space in the food chain again. Think about it. As the amount of carp goes down, there will be more food for native species, and less of these small native species are going to be getting eaten up by the carp. Of course, this problem is not solely created by carp either. Similar to why there are so many geese in the United States, we created the environments that make them successful. By building a ton of ponds and golf courses and things that geese do really well in, we created an area where, although geese aren't invasive, they have become so ridiculously widespread and overpopulated. The same thing is happening with carp. They are creating Australian river ecosystems that are highly polluted and are good for these carp to live in, but not good for the native species. And a true attempt to get the carp out of Australia would have to involve not just killing the carp, but cleaning up the rivers too, because they will come right back. The biggest worry, in my opinion though, is the disease spreading to other fish, and killing the native species that the government is trying to protect with this. The scientists assure us that that is highly unlikely, but being overconfident in things not spreading, ironically, is how we got into the situation in the first place. While diseases that are specific to one species don't often make large jumps, to say that it's impossible would be pretty naive. COVID likely came from bats, HIV likely came from primates, and measles probably came from cows. If diseases can make a jump like that, suddenly a jump from one little fish to another little fish doesn't seem quite as insane. Though ironically, Australia doesn't even have it as bad as many other countries dealing with invasive carp. For example, in the US, many species of Asian carp are invading and threatening the way of life for many, many people. Whereas in Australia, they mainly only have one invader, the common carp, who is considered less invasive and actually was naturalized in the United States, meaning it no longer poses a threat to the native ecosystems that it's in. If the true invasive carp properly took over Australia, there may not be anything left in the waters. This is why treating killing the carp as a final solution is naive. As the world becomes more interconnected, invasive species are going to spread more and more. Ecosystems are going to homogenize. Supporting your natives and giving them the ecosystems that they were thriving in before humans came in will do a much better job at keeping these invasives at bay, rather than trying to shoot down each carp as it arrives. For now though, let's just hope that the carp herpes does its job and nothing more. Thanks for watching.